Warm greetings once more from the OSC Secretariat, where we are starting what is, if my memory does not fail me, the 8th episode of The Third Way Live with the SG. A space that, as you are all aware by now, I hope, a space that is supposed to provide a platform for, not only for me to speak a bit more extensively, less, in a manner that is less structured, about the third way of development, about what we are doing from the OSC Secretariat in order to concretize this vision, but most crucially, a platform that seeks to ensure that your voice is heard. A platform that enables me to engage with each one of you, those that are up very early in Latin America and the Caribbean, those that are up quite late in Asia Pacific, those that are on more or less the same time zone as we are here in Addis Ababa, and that is in the entirety of the continent of Africa, the Arab world as well. And not only to engage with you, each one of you more directly, but to hear your questions, which I will seek without any kind of filters to answer, to engage with your critiques and seek to address them to the extent of my ability, and also to engage and hear, and who knows, perhaps to make my own your proposals with regards to the way forward for our collective. And of course, this engagement can happen just for the sake of remembrance, can be done by you placing a comment in any one of our social platforms that are currently live, or ideally by you calling us through WhatsApp, which will enable your voice to be heard, not just in terms of content, but also in terms of sound. Now, as I was thinking earlier today about what it is that, as usual, there is this short moment of introduction when I can't stop myself from saying a few words before opening the floor to each one of you. That being said, I was sitting earlier today trying to reflect about what it is that I wanted to discuss today. And after some reflection, because the truth is that over the past 7 episodes that we've already had, we've spoken about the third way of development in a very general manner. We've spoken about climate change. We've spoken about ecologically driven development. We've spoken about balanced and inclusive education, about technology, about a variety of issues. We even spoke about the role of leadership within our endeavors, within the effort, the collective effort of building a third way of development. We've also spoken about the importance of politicizing in the noble sense of the term. And all of this, of course, that we've already discussed seems to me crucial. And as far as I could, I tried not to limit it to the OSC and the OSC's activities, because as I've said before, the vision of a third way of development, whilst we at the OSC, by mandate from the member states, are spearheading those endeavors, this vision goes far beyond the OSC Secretariat. It goes far beyond, in fact, the state membership and associate membership of the OSC. But I also realize that we are only 2 weeks away from the second ordinary session of the OSC General Assembly. And of course, this meeting of our member states, our associate members, is ultimately a momentous event for the organization. I've said in the past that I do not believe, or I have lost faith in conferences for the sake of conferences, where we seem to be agreeing or trying to debate to agree things that we have already agreed. But the OSC General Assembly is a different kind of meeting, because it is first and foremost the principal organ of this organization, the principal decision-making, policy-making body of the OSC. And at this next ordinary session of the General Assembly, there will be a number of issues that will be submitted for the deliberation, the review, the amendment, and the approval of our members. And at the heart of that General Assembly is the program and the budget for the upcoming 2 years, for 2025, 2026. And whereas, of course, we have not yet published it because it is pending approval of the members, I thought that it would be important, now that we have circulated the common program and budget proposal, to just give you an overview of what is the OSC planning to do over the next 2 years, on a far more concrete basis than what we have discussed in the past. And this program proposal that we've submitted to the member states for this General Assembly, I've decided to name at the hemistick, despite some resistance from some of the team members who said that it was a term that seemed too technical, too abstract. But this is perhaps my opportunity to explain why. At the hemistick. The hemistick is a term that comes from poetry. And it basically means the midpoint, the halfway point of a verse. And again, you might ask, legitimately, what does the common program have to do with the midpoint of a verse? And the truth is that some of you may know, some may not. But when I was elected as the founding Secretary General of the OSC at our founding summit in January 2020, I was elected for a 6-year non-renewable term, starting from the first General Assembly. That means that from January 2020 to December 2021, I was Secretary General elect and chair of the preparatory committee. But on the 6th of December 2021, I finally took office as Secretary General, taking my solemn oath of office to serve as selflessly as possible. And what this means is that this General Assembly coincides approximately with my hemistick, with the halfway point of my verse as Secretary General, the halfway point of my term of office. I will have 3 years of service behind me, and, save force majeure, 3 years of service ahead. And when I decided to title the common program proposal as At the Hemistick, it was a reflection, of course, of this, but it was also as a response to two concerns of mine. Because over the past few months, I have heard a number of colleagues, friends, ambassadors from the member states, as well as some ministers, mentioning that perhaps we should consider, as a collective. As member states, because I have no power with regards to this, consider amending the constitutive charter of the Organization of Southern Cooperation, that I may have 2 more years or 3 more years as Secretary General. And of course, this is extremely flattering. And it does bring at least some satisfaction of knowing that we are not, or I have not, been leading the OSC in the wrong direction. But it is also my firm belief, and perhaps that the naming of this common proposal as at the hemistick is a ratification of that view, that under no circumstance, and I see some of the people here opening up their eyes, but once we say it publicly, there is no going back. Under no circumstance should the constitutive charter of the Organization of Southern Cooperation be amended in order to enable me as Secretary General, the next Secretary General, or any Secretary General for that matter, to have a longer term than constitutionally provided for. And the reason that I say this, it's not only legalistic arguments that once you have a constitutive charter you shouldn't change it. If that was the case, then we wouldn't have within the constitutive charter an article about amendments. At the end of the day, the constitutive charter was not divinely revealed to the member states. It was the effort of individuals. And as circumstances change, these may change. But of course, my number 1 priority as Secretary General, as the founding Secretary General, with a 6-year term of office, which is not non-negligible, and if you take into account being Secretary General-elect and Chair of the Preparatory Committee, then it is almost 8 years as a mandate. Having had that term, my first priority, my first responsibility, I believe, was not only to spearhead the building of an intergovernmental organization from scratch, and in the meantime, in parallel, ensure that whilst we are building this institution, that we delivered concretely and tangibly for the member states, programmatically, to contribute to their development endeavors. But my effort has been an effort as well of institutionalization. An institutionalization where, and I have said this to many of the Secretariat members, and I apply it first and foremost to the Secretary General, that no one is indispensable. Cemeteries, burial sites are full of people who once thought themselves indispensable. And my number 1 priority as Secretary General was to ensure that as we build this institution to be an effective, positive force for change, which I think we have achieved to a large degree, even though there is much more to do, is that no matter who comes as Secretary General after me, even if it was Lucifer himself, that they would have no other choice than to serve the common interests of member states, and that this organization continues moving forward. And of course, when the time comes, when my 6 years approach, it appears to me that if I have been successful as Secretary General, then by then, there would be no need for me to stay on through an amendment to the Constitutive Charter, because this will have become a true, sustainable institution. And if by then it is still not the case, then that means I will have failed, and you do not reward failure by an extension of terms of offices. But at the hemistic also, because there is this poem that for many years has guided at least my approach to many a matter. And that poem is a poem by Walt Whitman. Some of you will have heard me quoting it. And it's a poem in which he's asking about life, the purpose of life amongst all the challenges, the difficulties, the cities filled with the foolish, and then he says, and who more foolish than I? And eventually, after this questioning goes on, he asks, what good amid these, O me, O life? Answer, that you are here, that life exists and identity, that the powerful play goes on, and that you may contribute a verse. Our role as individuals is not to rewrite the entirety of the play, only to contribute a single verse. A single verse that is sublime enough, potent enough, that it changes the direction of the play. And therefore, at the hemistic, my penultimate program proposal for the member states and the associate members, because we are proud of everything that we have achieved. But as I've said before, the OSC is the club of the perpetually dissatisfied, of those who, looking back, do not only see everything that has been achieved, but everything that is yet to be achieved. And therefore, this programmatic proposal that I'm submitting is one that I structured in line with the title that comes from poetry. Around 7 stanzas, or 7 chapters, or axes of action. And I would like to share very broadly what these are with some of the flagship initiatives under each one. But I will not, of course, list them all, because that would take us hours and hours, and I am keen to open up the floor. But the first is, of course, stanza 1, which is becoming knowledge-powered societies. Becoming knowledge-powered societies because the role of knowledge in our development endeavors is beyond dispute. However, it seems to me essential to also recognize that there is a persisting north-south knowledge divide, which remains an impediment to our endeavors from the south for development. And if we want to bridge that divide, and in order to genuinely leverage knowledge to build knowledge-powered societies, we must address, as I've discussed in the past, 3 interlinked inequities in knowledge. The inequity of the nature of knowledge. That is, what knowledge is legitimate and which knowledge is not. Who gets to determine that legitimacy? And in an era in which we are undergoing as an entire world a polycrisis, a crisis of multiple dimensions that keeps as a domino effect, impacting and generating other subsidiary crises that are directly the result of certain paradigms, conceptions of growth and progress, of economic development that are not sustainable. It has become essential for our countries, our peoples, our intellectuals, our universities to develop newer epistemologies that can enable a genuine, authentic, sustainable paradigm shift when it comes to development. And that means, yes, our universities are essential in this endeavor. But to develop new epistemologies, we must also renew dialogue and integrate within this endeavor entire knowledge domains that have been historically marginalized, delegitimized by dominant models or epistemologies of knowledge. And these are our ancestral knowledge, our popular knowledge. I say ancestral and popular because yes, there is that dimension of ancestral knowledge, endogenous knowledge, that is crucial. Without romanticizing it, not everything that is ancestral knowledge must be taken at face value. But I say also popular because beyond ancestral knowledge, knowledge today is being produced not only in our universities, not only in research labs, it is being produced everywhere. In the private company that invests in research and development and innovation. It is being developed by the school teacher that tries different modalities in order to ensure that their kids, their students, learn more effectively. Knowledge is produced everywhere, popularly, and not just academically. The second inequity that we have to overcome, and that is why stanza 1 is about becoming knowledge-powered societies, is the inequity, the profound inequity of the economics of knowledge. We have all heard quite often of the emergence of the knowledge economy, which has moved into the global knowledge economy. And whereas, yes, knowledge can be a very valuable economic asset that contributes to development, contributes to growth, the global knowledge economy cannot be dissociated from global economic inequality. I say this because COVID, which even though I was shocked recently when someone mentioned 5 years ago during the lockdowns, because it feels it was yesterday. But no matter that it was 5 years ago, we are still reeling from the consequences of COVID, and we must still learn the lessons of COVID to build the better societies, the better future that we want. And COVID-19 demonstrated that the global knowledge economy continues to be tied and reflects the global economic inequality that we are all aware of. From a lack of funding for research in terms of vaccines being channeled to the south, most of the funding for research in terms of vaccines to COVID-19 was directed to researchers and research institutions in the north. To the fact of vaccine production having been monopolized in the north because of knowledge that had been generated, critical knowledge in terms of health that had been generated and commercialized and protected by intellectual property rights, that made it so that the South could not produce those same vaccines, even though there was a global shortage of vaccines. Clearly, we must address the inequity of the economics of knowledge, which implies, amongst other things, ensuring that there is greater funding for researchers and research institutions in the South. It must also mean that we must reinforce within the South the research, innovation, common public good interlinks. That is, ability to undertake research in the South with the necessary funding, the necessary mechanisms to translate that research into practical, applicable innovations that respond to development needs, but also ensuring, and that is why I speak of common public good at the end, that the fruits of that research and that innovation benefit society equitably. And finally, the third of the inequities of knowledge that I think is crucial to address is the inequity of the geopolitics of knowledge. And there's many things that we could discuss and debate about when it comes to the geopolitics of knowledge. From the lack of mobility of researchers in the South, because of what we could, to be provocative, because we said without filters, what is in effect a regime, a worldwide regime, of visa apartheid. If you have a passport from certain regions, the likelihood of you getting a visa is much lower than if you come from another region of the world. So the geopolitics of knowledge in terms of lack of mobility, in terms of our researchers, our intellectuals, our universities, we must also address in that the lack of visibility of the research being done in the South, that does not reach the international visibility that is at the source of collaboration and uptake. We must address the scarcity of peer-reviewed journals of international reach within the South. That also, of course, means that since most peer-reviewed journals of international reach, of international visibility, is in the North, we must inevitably discuss and challenge the hegemony of certain languages, mostly the English language, in the production and dissemination of knowledge. Because all of this together puts researchers from the South at an immediate disadvantage. And whereas these three inequities, of course, fuel the North-South knowledge divide, it also contributes greatly, or exemplifies, the South-South academic collaboration divide. Where even though the South is very diverse in its realities, we share some systemic challenges and aspirations that make it fruitful for our researchers to work together. It is true that research amongst our countries, joint research projects, remains limited. And that also means that there is a lack of expertise within our academic institutions of the Greater South as a whole, in a variety of disciplines. And of course, all of this rationale is what leads us to a number of initiatives that we are proposing. Of course, each stanza has main lines of action and flagship implementation initiatives. I will save you the trouble of listing it all. But I will mention just a number of the flagship initiatives that we are proposing for the next biennium. The first, of course, is the expansion of the Greater South Information System that we launched in its beta phase this biennium. The Greater South Information System, GreSFET, And GreSFET is a platform that we launched to provide free of charge access to our institutions, our researchers, our students, our universities, our research institutions and centers, free of charge access to an ever-growing database of academic knowledge, but also of endogenous knowledge databases. When we launched it a few months ago, of course, there was only 20,000 resources. Today we have superseded the 400,000. And this seeks to democratize access to knowledge, quite obviously, but also make research and knowledge from the South more visible. And by integrating artificial intelligence and providing hence instantaneous translations of approximately 90% of accuracy, not to substitute human translators, far from it, but to overcome the initial linguistic barrier to facilitate collaboration amongst researchers of the South. And therefore, for the new biennium, we are proposing to consolidate GreSFET, expand it in terms of the resources available, in terms of functionality, and in terms of reach through enrollments of our researchers. We're, of course, also proposing the establishment of additional regional transdisciplinary research centers within our countries. We have already reached a memorandum of understanding with the Republic of the Gambia to establish the first one for West Africa. But we plan also to open at least 2 additional ones in the next biennium to reinforce regional research ecosystems, to undertake research that is contextually relevant to those regions, and to enhance collaboration amongst researchers within those regions. And of course, we're also planning to work towards the establishment of a Southern Research, Innovation and Application Fund to bridge the financing gap between North and South, to give our researchers more equitable, greater access to finance to undertake research that is relevant, that is needed by our countries for their development endeavors. And finally, I was speaking of a lack of expertise when it comes to the South as a whole. Working with our higher education institutions to establish independent chairs and centers on the Greater South, so that there may be greater independent multidisciplinary reflection by our higher education institutions about issues of common interest for the South, challenges for the South, that we may also articulate, they may independently articulate proposals for our countries to overcome those challenges. But I look at Pearl, my dear Pearl, from the Pearl of Africa, that repeatedly looks at me saying that I'm speaking too much. So I will seek to be more concise. And I move on to the second stanza, stanza 2, which is becoming drivers of the technological revolution. I will not waste anyone's time by trying to explain the importance of technology and why we must leverage the potential of technology, dada. No. We are all aware, no need to convince the already convinced that they ought to be convinced of what they are already convinced. But I would like to argue that the techno-digital divide of which we are all aware between North and South, but also within countries of the South, rurally, and the divide between urban centers and rural areas in terms of the techno-digital divide. These are fundamentally, well, they cannot be resolved. They cannot be overcome by either donations of technology, even though we may be grateful for them, or the importation of technologies that are often costly. And the reason that this will not bridge the divide sustainably is because you are speaking in both cases of closed source technologies, patented technologies. That means technologies which, whilst they are useful to resolve the short-term issue, we cannot integrate within our systems. We cannot build upon. And within 5 to 6 years, 10 years to be generous, with the exponential development of technology, will be obsolete. And we will find ourselves exactly in the same situation we currently find ourselves in, which is being passengers rather than drivers of the technological revolution. And this is why the stanza is called, I've termed it, becoming drivers of the technological revolution. And this requires a threefold approach: leveraging, developing open source software that can be integrated within our systems, can be customized, can be built upon without generating vendor dependence. Of intensifying, bolstering South-South technological transfers, technology transfers, and digital consultation. And when I say South-South technological transfers, I am not only speaking of digital software, but also machinery that is essential to other endeavors within our countries for development. And finally, ensuring, building the necessary environments that stimulate the creativity of our youth, stimulate our economies by generating endogenous or homegrown technologies, whether these are nationally or regionally. But within this dynamic, I would be remiss in my duty if I were not to mention as well artificial intelligence, which has taken the world by storm. Every day I have to hear the word AI at least once now. And of course there's many considerations that we must give to AI, its ethical dimensions, also as well considering in which areas do we want to integrate AI, in which areas do we not want AI to be involved. But beyond these debates that have been had consistently, the truth remains that artificial intelligence, even open source artificial intelligence, software and platforms, remain very north-centric. What do I mean by that? Artificial intelligence is useful, effective, only when it is trained on colossal amounts of data. Yet overwhelmingly today, the AI that we know, both open source and closed source, tends to be trained on data that comes from the north, from northern contexts. That means AI that is not reflecting our realities, our priorities, our context, and therefore even if it is free of charge, even if it is open source, it is not enabling us as countries to achieve our objectives by integrating AI, because it is decontextualized. And therefore there is a need to work together. And of course this is fueled partly by the lack of digitization within our countries. Because how can you train AI on data that is still not digitized? And let me concretize what I'm saying. Today you have extraordinary AI software. Again, I know that it is not perfect, it is not meant to be, but it is useful on the day-to-day. AI software for translation, something as simple as this. And it tends to be very effective for translation between English and French, for instance, and the reverse. And if you are lucky enough to find AI that can translate from Swahili to Khmer, Well, it is, even if you find it is abysmal in terms of translation. That is a very concrete example of what I'm trying to say. And in this regard, of course, we have a number of initiatives at the OSC. Part of them that we're proposing for the member states, part of them is to provide the support needed through guides, policy guides and practices guides in order to foster endogenous technology development. But I'll focus on two key initiatives rather than all the other detail. The first is upscaling the Greater South Fair for Endogenous Technologies, GreSFET, the first edition to be held in December. And GreSFET, when I say upscaling it is a fair that every 2 years is meant to bring startups from across our countries, that they may have the visibility needed in order to build strategic partnerships, in order to secure the necessary investments, but also to learn from each other. So GreSFET, upscaling this Greater South Fair for Endogenous Technology. But the second, and I know it is not particularly attractive, but it is thoroughly needed, the establishment of an international Greater South Commission on artificial intelligence, that it may, under a mandate by our General Assembly, independently first map out all the existing initiatives with regards to AI that exist within the Greater South, but then to articulate clear recommendations on how to leverage artificial intelligence for southern contexts. Producing a flagship action-oriented report that can be put into practice as soon as it completes its mandate. Of course, another crucial aspect of the 7 stanzas that we're proposing is, of course, the third stanza, which is close to my heart, which is accelerating the balanced and inclusive transformation of education. As you're all aware, the OSC is custodian of the Universal Declaration of Balanced and Inclusive Education that was adopted in January 2020. But since its adoption, there seems to have been a general international consensus on the need to transform and not merely reform education. Because education can only be transformative if itself is transformed. The question, however, is how to transform our education systems. And we believe from the OSC that the UDBIE, the framework of balanced and inclusive education, provides a strong foundation in order to achieve this. On the one hand, through the 4 pillars of balanced and inclusive education, intraculturalism, that we may have education systems that better reflect our histories, our cultures, who we are as individuals, as well as the millenary interdependence that has existed between countries. Transdisciplinarity, that we may have education systems that prepare our youth to address the complexity of the world, which is never disciplinary. It is never just economics, just philosophy, just physics. Dialecticism, that our students may become protagonists within the classroom by articulating, problematizing the world and finding together solutions. And finally, contextuality. That is, we need some universal principles, but we also need our education systems to respond to national priorities, to local realities, to the individuality of each student. So the 4 pillars of BIEs creates a strong foundation, but also a systemic approach to educational reform. That is, education systems are akin are akin, no, you can sit down, I'm talking for a little bit for a while, akin to living organisms composed of subsystems or organisms that constantly mutually influence each other. It has direct and indirect agents. Direct agents, for instance, teachers. Indirect agents, for instance, other government ministries or parents. It has subsystems and satellite systems. A subsystem is the Curriculum Development Center within the Ministry of Education. A satellite system could be private schools. And all of those subsystems, satellite systems, direct and indirect agents, mutually influence each other. And for an educational transformation to be successful, you must ensure that there is an alignment within the system as a whole. You cannot transform the curriculum if you do not also transform teacher training to respond to that change in the curriculum. And therefore you must have an alignment in terms of coordination amongst the subsystems, the satellite systems, the direct and indirect agents, but you must also have coherence between the various capacities within the Ministry of Education. If the curriculum, if the teacher training is excellent and you have extraordinary teachers in terms of skills and capacities, but the curriculum is weak, then you cannot expect good results from the transformation. So the UDBIE provides us with a strong foundation for this transformation. The question is, now that we have the framework, what to do about it. And what we are proposing in terms of the next 2 years of the OSC Institute is a number of initiatives. But there's 3 flagships that I would like to mention. The first is to consolidate, expand the OSC Institute that we launched in January this year, and which has already, in this very short amount of time, built the capacities of 15, with the 16th soon to follow, of 15, the experts of 15 countries in terms of education, who in turn have approximately built the capacities, cascaded down that workshop, cascaded down this capacity building program to 250 individuals in their home countries. The OSC Institutes, which rejects the model of workshops of 3 days with a disappearance for 6 months to reappear for a workshop of 2 days. No, it adopts a model where the experts of member states come to the OSC Institute for a 2-month intensive capacity building program. And therefore expanding the OSC Institute, both to deliver more trainings, but also provide distance learning opportunities as well. The other one, of course, is to reinstate the Forum BIE 2030. As you may be aware, the OSC was created at the 3rd Forum BIE 2030 in January 2020, which was in Djibouti. And before that, the Forum BIE had been held in Mexico. And before that, the Forum BIE had been held in Geneva at the United Nations. And of course, with the creation of the OSC and the adoption of the Universal Declaration and COVID, the Forum BIE, in a certain sense, presented its goodbyes. But we think it is time for the Forum BIE to join us once more. The Forum BIE, which has been this extraordinary fruitful space of encounter, where throughout the 3 editions, ministers of education from across our countries civil society organizations from across our countries, universities from across our countries, individuals, intellectuals, practitioners from across our countries came together in the same space with a unique feature that during the panel discussions, we did not divide up between the countries and the universities, for instance. You would have a panel with a Minister of Education, a university rector, the head of an NGO, and a practitioner, a teacher. And through this multi-sectoral approach, the Forum BIE provided a space to exchange best practices, to identify amongst participants collaboration areas concrete to contribute to our endeavors. So reinstating the Forum BIE as an annual conference to happen in January to coincide with the International Day of Balanced Inclusive Education, and to conclude every year with a BIE award, a Balanced and Inclusive Education Award. I said 3 flagship initiatives, but I realized that we are running out of time. I am speaking for too long. So I will move on to the next stanza. And the next stanza is the 4th one, which is stanza 4, revitalizing cultural and artistic yields. Because unfortunately, culture and the arts have too often been forgotten from the mainstream development discourse. And whenever they have been articulated, it has been with a focus either on initiatives that ended up benefiting only the privileged few, or worse still, that focused exclusively on heritage, on conservation of our cultures. And whereas, yes, of course, our heritage is important, it must be protected, it must be valorized, there is no culture without a people. And people are not static. Our peoples are alive, they move, they grow, their aspirations change. And so do our cultures, absorbing influences, rooted in our past, but flourishing in the contemporary world. And without emphasizing culture and the arts as an integral part of development, we cannot hope to achieve a unifying language that transcends linguistic barriers, that generates dreams, that hence translates into mobilization. And again, without both of those, there is no transformation. And in this regard, this is why we are proposing to put as well culture and the arts at the heart of our endeavors. And it is actually in our constitutive charter. But for the next 2 years, I am proposing to our members to reinforce our action there. And there's a number of flagship initiatives, of course, but 2 that I would like to mention is upscaling the Festival of the Greater South, which was held this year in its embryonic form. But the Festival of the Greater South as this platform that brings artists in all their forms, that is poets, writers, singers, dancers, from across, artisans, painters, from across our countries. That our peoples may meet culturally, that we may bridge the cultural divides that exist between our countries. Because yes, the South shares many challenges, many aspirations, but if we do not build a sense as well of identity, of commonality, the South will only remain an abstract concept. or a category that you find in economic analysis. And the truth is that was extraordinary at this festival, for instance, is that when the Cuban dance troupe that was there started to perform, a number of participants, Congolese, Ethiopian as well, Togolese, recognized themselves, recognized their beats, their music within the Cuban performance. And therefore the festival, that it may be a point of encounter amongst our peoples, but also that shows this common thread that seems to run throughout the South in terms of culture. But again, the Festival of the Greater South showcasing not just traditional dances, but contemporary music, contemporary paintings, contemporary performances that are rooted in our past, but are entirely contemporary and modern. The other initiative that is crucial is working towards the establishment of a network of cultural houses or cultural centers of the Greater South, what I'd like to term cultural houses of the Greater South, throughout our countries, that act and serve as a common space, a catalyst within each country of cultural vibrancy, but also that is linked to other houses across the South, that we may have artistic residencies and exchanges throughout our countries, that the Ethiopian painter may go to Nicaragua in one of those houses, stay 2 months, showcase their art, engage with other artists, and in this fruitful encounter, build the bridges and establish the people that we need to achieve the transformation that we want. I promise you, Pearl, I am almost done, and I do apologize to all of you for speaking longer than I had planned, but it seems to me important. The fifth stanza, stanza 5, is of course creating shared green prosperity. Because we may speak of technological development, of building knowledge-powered societies, of revitalizing cultural and artistic yields, but ultimately, we must also speak of an aspect that is central to development: the economy. And of course, when speaking of the economy, we have to address, and this is what we're proposing to the Member States over the next 2 years, building on the strengths of the biennium that is currently concluding. We must address 3 interlinked needs of our countries when it comes to the economy, when it comes to the international financial architecture. The first is the need for greater fiscal space, for our countries to invest in the critical areas of their development. When I say greater fiscal space, let's call a spade, to ensure greater debt relief. Because in a world where 3.3 billion people live in countries where their governments have no other alternative, no other choice than to spend more on debt service than they can on education or health, the issue of greater fiscal space is not just an issue of a lack of wish to pay, or that we do not want the interests of creditors to be protected. Of course, it is legitimate to protect the interests of creditors. But we also have a human dimension of debt that must be taken into account. The other need of our countries, of course, is to have a greater access to less conditional and highly concessional finance. That is, for our countries to be able to access the finance that is needed at very low interest rates, with greater grace periods, with longer maturities, as well as grants, to finance their development endeavors. And on a less conditional basis. That is, it is essential for our countries in securing fresh finance, not to be told, as if we were children or irresponsible, which sectors need finance and which sectors don't. Most of our countries today, if any of our countries went to request finance to, say, build a space industry, a satellite construction industry, most of our countries would be told, hold on, this is very cute, thank you very much, but you have other problems right now. First you have to build this road. We'll give you finance for the road. Not taking into account that development is not just linear, it can be exponential. Maybe building that satellite industry, maybe building this space industry would enable our countries to become the foremost country within a region or within the world for the space industry, generate less dependency on external providers for internet access, perhaps, or perhaps generating more income for our countries that would enable us to build a road without requiring a loan. And the third need is to have more strategic investments, which is linked to what I was saying before. More strategic investments, because debt in and of itself is not bad. Assuming reasonable, fair interest rates and maturity times, there is good debt and there is bad debt. A loan or a credit that a country may secure in order to import alimentation, food, products, whilst, yes, might be needed if you have not achieved food sovereignty, is a bad debt, because it is a debt for consumables. A debt, however, a loan that we contract in order to invest in sustainable agriculture that enhances our production capacities to feed our people, therefore reducing imports of food in dollars we don't have, and at the same time enabling us to export more food. That is, in effect, a good debt, because it has went to a productive area and contributes to sovereignty. And in this regard, of course, we have a number of, and finally, of course, apologies. In creating shared, you will have understood the shared, but perhaps the green prosperity. We must, as countries, undertake an endeavor that is one that recognizes that the development models, and this is also the rationale for the third way of development, the development models that we have inherited have not only failed in answering the aspirations of our peoples for genuine, authentic development, but are also profoundly detrimental because they are leading us to a climate catastrophe. And when we speak, therefore, of green prosperity, we are speaking of, yes, prosperity, but one that stems from a paradigm shift that abandons the dynamics that have led us to the climate crisis and integrates the environment at the center of our development endeavors. But in that, what we are speaking about is ecologically driven development. And why do we speak of ecologically driven development? Because ecology or the environment, environmental policy, has too often and until today been taken as or seen as just an additional constraint, a limitation. We should not do this, we should not do that, we need to protect this, we need to protect that. That is environmental policy and the ecology as a profoundly conservative endeavor, defensive endeavor. We have to protect this, we shouldn't do that, we shouldn't do this. And whereas, of course, there's many things that we should no longer do. There are many sectors that we need to aim to disengage from. But in addition, the environment, ecologically driven development, because these policies can also be job generating, can be prosperity generating. Ecology doesn't just have to be not doing it and not doing that. For instance, by moving towards the production, not just the purchase, the production of solar panels within our countries, using critical minerals that are available within our countries, we are creating new industries. We are creating jobs. We are creating economic activity while simultaneously contributing to sustainability. And so we have a number of flagship initiatives that we are proposing for the next biennium as part of this stanza, but I will limit myself to 3. The first is reinforcing the capacity of the Common Leveraging Union of Borrowers, the club, which our member states created in November 2023 as the world's first and only sovereign union or union of sovereign borrowers, that we may on the one hand better coordinate as borrowing countries to achieve debt relief, but also better coordinate as countries to have greater access to fresh, highly concessional finance with little to no conditionality. The second is, of course, the launch of one of the 3 main organs of the OSC as identified in our constitutive charter. And what we're planning for the next 2 years is make sure that it is entirely operational, and that is the OSC's financial subsidiary, which is, to put it simply, the OSC's multilateral development bank, with 3 functions and 1 unique characteristic. The first unique characteristic is 100% of the shares, as decided by the member states, will be held by the OSC as an organization, which means that as opposed to other multilateral development banks, the supreme body, the governing body, in fine, of the financial subsidiary of the OSC will be the General Assembly, which means that as opposed to other multilateral development banks, it will be 1 country, 1 vote, preserving that democratic nature. But the 3 functions are to undertake investments in socially and ecologically responsible projects within member states that may contribute to their sustainable economic development, and from the funds generated to provide member states with what the Charter calls solid refinancing for their development, that contributes both to access to highly concessional, if not grant-based finance, while simultaneously contributing to the contribute to access, but also contributing to debt relief, as identified in the Constitutive Charter. And the third and last function of the financial subsidiary that we are planning and proposing to make fully operational within the next biennium is also to contribute to the, and here I'm quoting the Constitutive Charter, to the OSC's budget so as to gradually reduce and eventually fully cover member states' obligations to the budget, so that the OSC budget can become self-financing and member states no longer have a burden even though it is an investment of contributing to the budget. And the last one, of course, with regards to ecologically driven development is, like AI, establishing a Greater South Independent Commission on ecologically driven development that may map out the innovative, outside-the-box practices and policies that exists across our countries and articulate concrete, actionable proposals that may be immediately implemented by the OSCE Secretariat and taken up by the Member States once its works complete within the next biennium. We only have 2 more stanzas, and I kindly ask all of you to be patient. The 6th stanza, stanza 6, that we are proposing in the next biennium program, is, as you will suspect, from an organization called the Organization of Southern Cooperation, of intensifying South-South cooperation and integration. And in this, we have to bear in mind that the South is constituted of vastly diverse peoples, individuals, institutions that have different trajectories, different cultural frameworks, different day-to-day realities. But that the South also shares some systemic challenges and common aspirations, making it necessary and desirable to work together to achieve that third way of development. But of course, this dynamic, in fact, of national divergence from which you can have mutual learning, and international convergence from which multilateral action stems, this is where the rationale for South-South cooperation emerges, and for the OSCE emerges. But for South-South cooperation to achieve this aspiration of a third way of development, we firmly believe that we must preserve in South-South cooperation what I call the 3 Ds. It must remain diverse. When I say it remains diverse, is that we must accept and embrace the fact that South-South cooperation must be the respectful encounter of politically, ideologically, and culturally diverse countries and governments. In that it is in this respectful encounter of our differences that our universality emerges. It must also remain democratic. That is, South-South cooperation and the OSCE must preserve at all times the principle of one country, one vote. That there are no big countries and small countries, but that when we meet together, we democratically decide as countries, with an equality of voices, what it is that we collectively need, regardless of our respective economic capacity, regardless of our respective land mass and population size. And the third, it must remain development-centered. It must be a cooperation that seeks to tangibly contribute to the aspirations of our respective and common peoples for authentic, tangible development, for a third way of development, without entering into petty quarrels on whether we are left, right, center, up, down, but to work together towards common objectives that tangibly make a difference to our peoples and our countries. But of course, this South-South cooperation with the 3 Ds itself must embody a new kind of multilateralism, one that I've mentioned several times. A multilateralism characterized by equality amongst parties, equity in our relations, and solidarity that is practiced horizontally, rather than charity that is practiced vertically. But in saying so, I also recognize that this South-South cooperation, and this is the rationale for this stanza, to be sustainable in the long term, yes, on the one hand, needs those 3 Ds, yes, needs to embody a new kind of multilateralism, but it must also, this South-South cooperation, be accompanied in parallel by a dynamic of integration on 3 interlinked fronts. Intra-regional, within each region, inter-regional, between the regions of the South, and people to people. And therefore, with this rationale in mind, we're proposing a number of flagship initiatives over the next biennium to the member states. But I will limit myself to 3. The first is building and adopting a genuine common agenda, collective agenda of the Greater South, by the Greater South, for a 3rd way of development. And this implies and entails maintaining and institutionalizing the Congress of the Greater South, that is bringing all sectors, regionally at first for consultations and eventually at a summit of the Greater South next year, to articulate concrete proposals that will then be debated and consolidated within a common agenda for the construction of a 3rd way of development that we need to collectively define. The second flagship initiative is the framework to reinforce exchanges between youth and regions through education, Freire, which is, to put it simply, the OSC's version, the Greater South's version of the European Union's Erasmus program, that is a student and academic mobility scheme across our 3 continents. That the young person from Southeast Asia coming from a tropical climate may, instead of going to Canada at minus 17 degrees Celsius to study tropical medicine, may actually go to a country in Central America that has a tropical climate to study tropical medicine. But also in the knowledge that when our youth go and live abroad in another country of the South to study, even for a semester, this builds a sustainable bridge between countries that outlasts any geopolitical or political transformations. And finally, the third of the flagship initiatives that we are proposing is of enhancing and reinforcing and multiplying the OSC's initiatives to engage in the variety of regions of the Greater South. And that goes with more activities in other regions of the South, while simultaneously establishing regional offices that can act as catalysts for the transformation that we want in each region, but in a manner that is far more contextual than we can do from a centralized headquarters. And the final stanza is, of course, that of solidifying the organization the South deserves. Because the OSC, over the past 2 years since we have entered our executive phase, has done extraordinary progress. And in fact, I think this progress can be defined or conceived as the completion of 4 distinct phases. The first from January 2020 to December 2021. That is, from the moment the Founding Summit adopted our charter to the moment the first General Assembly met. The ideational, preparatory phase of the organization, in which we had to conceive the rules of procedure, the financial regulations, the structure of the Secretariat, and the programmatic proposals for the member states. And then from January 2022 to June 2023, we could speak in a certain manner of the institutional operationalization phase. The phase in which we had to negotiate and establish the headquarters of the organization. The phase in which we had to start hiring the Secretariat of professionals capable of delivering on the aspirations of member states by supporting them effectively and efficiently implementing the common program. And then, of course, from June 2023 to December 2023, the crucial phase, which was the intramural consolidation, where we had to consolidate our secretariats, consolidate our endeavors in order to be in a position to deliver. And therefore, from January 2024 to date, the programmatic delivery phase, which we have very successfully undertaken. And whereas we can celebrate those phases of completion, I believe that with their completion, we must open a new chapter within the OSCE's history that will exist in parallel to this programmatic delivery phase that will continue. And that is one of greater engagements at the multilateral level, of greater confederation of efforts with all institutions, all organizations, all countries that share our aspirations as established by the member states. And this goes by cementing greater coordination and cooperation with other multilateral organizations, ranging from the United Nations to the African Union, passing by the Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization to ASEAN. Whilst on the other hand, which seems crucial to me, leveraging the expertise and the knowledge that exists within our greater self to enhance our strategic decision making. And hence why part of what I am proposing to the member states for the next biennium is the creation of a council of the wise. In any event, I know that I have spoken at great length, but it appears to me essential. What I do promise is, regardless of what Pearl and Kulsi indicate this time, I will strive to give as much time as I have to my own introduction to the question and answer session, subject to questions being there, of course, or comments or critiques. But to conclude, having mentioned all of this, I was earlier this week, during my short breaks, because we are working round the clock at the OSC, going through the collected works and speeches of Martin Luther King Jr. And I came across, again, some of his quotes from parts of his speeches, which to me exemplify the spirit of the OSCE. Because I do believe that MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., has been unjustly sanitized in history. What I mean by this is that most people only remember, because that is what is being told to us constantly, of I have a dream. A beautiful speech. But mind you, not the most radical of his speeches. And Martin Luther King was a genuine visionary that had a radical approach. In the good sense, that is, of going to the root of the problem. In any event, I came across this and I thought I would conclude today by reading you those 3 quotes from Martin Luther King, which I've taken from 3 different speeches, from 3 different years. One is from 1959, one is from 1967, and one is from 1958. But I think it exemplifies the spirit that is ours collectively as we move towards this General Assembly, and how I perceive my hemistick, in which he says this extraordinary set of quotes. Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step towards the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle. The tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. So we are challenged. To work indefatigably for the full realization of the dream of brotherhood and integration. This is no time for apathy nor complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action. And because we need the tireless exertions of dedicated individuals, which go beyond the Secretariat of the OSC, but includes every single one of you, and with a sense of the fierce urgency of now. This is why we have those sessions, and this is why, despite a long intervention from me, I open the floor to your questions, comments, critiques, and proposals. No, we will continue. I'm being told that we have to end it. Is that what you are telling me? No, we will not. We will listen to the questions, and if the questions are not there, as you will recall, we are next to a mosque, and therefore this is the call to prayer, to the Muslim prayer, the Maghrib time, and again, which exemplifies being in the south. And as I said the last time that the adhan arrived, whilst we were speaking, it also exemplifies the spirit of our human endeavors. Because we are in a city in Addis Ababa where we also hear the call from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And in this encounter, you recognize once and for all that the forms may be different, the words may be different, but ultimately, deep down, we are all one and the same as human beings. The spirit, the aspiration, the spiritual undertaking is the same. So I will just look at the questions or comments. Could I ask you for another coffee, please? So if you just give us a moment. So I see a question from Dr. Deoraj Kausi, who says, you are midway in the pathway of OSC development. Could you tell us your successes and how they were achieved? What was the biggest stumbling block you faced? This is, first and foremost, Doctor, a pleasure to greet you virtually once more. this is ultimately, I suppose, a very challenging question to address or respond to in a concise manner. But I will strive to do my very best in this regard. Because you are asking if the OSC successes, how they were achieved, what was the biggest stumbling block we faced. And perhaps the best way to articulate is to actually take your question on the other, from the end. Because when you are building an intergovernmental organization from scratch, especially when your constitutive charter is adopted weeks before COVID-19, the stumbling blocks come before the successes. And of course, Doctor, thank you. And of course, Doctor, let me start by saying that explain the history of the OSC, which in itself contains it all. When the constitutive charter of the Organization of Southern Cooperation was adopted in January 2020, it came as a result of a multi-year process of consensus building amongst our countries that had the visionary quality of recognizing two things. The first, that we needed to articulate, in the words of our charter, a third way of development that would be more capable of answering our aspirations as countries, but also that countries of the South are extremely diverse, but that it was necessary because of the commonality of challenges and aspirations to work together, not against anyone, but towards a specific vision. And of course, when I was elected in January 2020, I was elected as Secretary General-elect, and my only mandate at the time, because as you are aware, since the OSC is intergovernmental, the Charter was adopted, but it had not entered into force. It would enter into force once at least 10 of the founding state signatories had ratified the Charter, at which point the First General Assembly would be convened to take the decisions and to start the activities of the OSC. And of course, when I was elected, my only mandate constitutionally was from Article 14, immediate application. That is the only article that immediately entered into force. And my only mandate was to serve as Secretary General-elect as the ex officio chair of the preparatory committee of the organization and appoint its members. And of course, past the jubilation and the celebration of the birth of a new intergovernmental organization, which in itself would have meant extraordinary challenges, because we did not collectively create, the countries did not create an intergovernmental organization, a new one, just to be like all the others. But we were faced, soon enough, within weeks of the creation of the OSC, the adoption of the constitutive charter, we were faced by the advent of COVID-19. In fact, I even recall that right after our founding summit, I was sitting with a group of individuals and we were going through the news. It was in the morning. And we were seeing about this virus that was happening in China, but we didn't think too much of it. It wasn't alarming. And within weeks, of course, the unimaginable happened. All the certainties we had about the world came crashing down, and COVID occurred, with lockdowns across the world. And even then, our thought was, like most, that this was going to be a matter of a month or two. Nobody had envisaged that it would last for as long as it did. In any event, one of the challenges in these early days was, how do you appoint a preparatory committee for this organization when nobody could travel, nobody could meet? And of course, like most, and also because we refused to give ourselves any kind of excuse to delay our endeavors, we very quickly constituted the preparatory committee, even though it was much smaller than we had initially planned, partly because of COVID, and started to meet, like most, virtually, which brought in itself extraordinary challenges. Because building an intergovernmental organization on Zoom is not particularly easy to do. But we soldiered through, and eventually we were able to all meet in Djibouti, where we had our provisional headquarters. And we undertook that work that was extremely challenging. But at the same time, we were faced by the imperative, because we genuinely thought, I genuinely believed, perhaps excess of optimism on my part, that the General Assembly would meet in December 2020. It is 1 year before when it actually met. And so we worked tirelessly as the preparatory committee to ensure that all the documentation would be ready by August 2020, which is what we did. And of course, the second challenge that occurred was we needed our member states to deposit their instruments of acceptance so that the Charter would enter into force, so that we can convene the First General Assembly. But of course, one of the core challenges that we faced at the OSC was put very simply, the fact that, understandably and legitimately, that with the advent of COVID, with national assemblies not meeting, with the health and economic crisis faced by all countries, the priority was not on ratifying an instrument of acceptance. It was on meeting and overcoming the major challenge that was the COVID-19 pandemic and its multidimensional consequences. And so we had to work, again, virtually, with the inability to travel with our member states in order to ensure an entry into force within reasonable timeframes, in accordance to national procedures, which was achieved on the 18th of May 2021. That is less than a year and 4 months from the adoption of the Charter, which would have been already a record without a pandemic. But more impressive still, with a pandemic, which demonstrated that commitment of our member states. In any event, we had to convene the First General Assembly in December 2021. And Doctor, I dare say that that was perhaps, compared to everything that we had to go through before, perhaps the easiest challenge we had to overcome. But the question was, if you remember, in 2021 we were still speaking about the potential for new lockdowns because of the new variants of COVID. And so the first question I had to ask myself as Secretary General-elect is, yes, but the problem is our state members are from Latin America and the Caribbean, are from Asia and the Pacific, Africa, the Arab world. That is, the time zones are so vast, and the number of documents we had to present for the first General Assembly because it had to approve absolutely everything. We were speaking of documents that we presented that had more than 700 pages. And that excludes the resolutions. Well, this can clearly not happen on Zoom. Not that we do not want to, but it would not be practical. How could we expect one of our ministers to be up at 2 a.m. to discuss 700 pages, another one to be up at 10 p.m., but the meeting is definitely going to take at least 15 hours? And so we then I took the decision that it was necessary to convene it in a place where if travel bans would occur, our countries could still meet. And therefore I selected Geneva, Switzerland, where we had to engage with the Swiss authorities for them to authorize the OSC to temporarily establish offices with the immunities and privileges that are usual to intergovernmental organizations, and convene our General Assembly in Geneva. Why Geneva? Because it was the second diplomatic hub after New York and Geneva, after New York. And all of our member states, save one, had ambassadors or permanent representatives in Geneva. So if there were travel bans, the ambassadors could meet on behalf of their countries. And we decided on the dates. It was from the 6th of December to the 8th of December, 2021. And believe it or not, the week of our first General Assembly, Omicron became a major concern, the Omicron variant of COVID. Travel ban. And then, of course, we were still able to meet. Some of our member states' ministers were able to come. Some sent some virtual statements, but mostly we were able to have the permanent representatives represent. Of course, the main challenge there was the work of ensuring prior to the GA that the ambassadors would be fully briefed about the OSC, because since the OSC had been created in Djibouti, at a summit in Djibouti, the ambassadors in Geneva were not necessarily involved in the process and did not necessarily have all the information at hand. But because of the importance of the first General Assembly, it was important that they understood every single aspect. So that was the first challenge. But we went through it. But challenges breed challenges, Doctor. And the last item on the agenda of the first General Assembly was, where will we establish our permanent headquarters? Because as Secretary General, I could not appoint the entirety of the Secretariat of the OSC, and therefore could not deliver the program without a headquarters. Because when you want to hire people, believe it or not, they do ask, for some reason, where will I live? And I would say, well, I don't know yet. And they would say, well, in what continent at least? And I would say, well, I don't know yet. And understandably, they would say, Secretary General, thank you for considering me, but what about you let me know once you know where you're going to be based? And at the end of the General Assembly, understandably, the member states did not settle on a location. One country expressed its interest in hosting, which was Ethiopia, but the member states did not decide. And therefore, they delegated the Secretary General to engage with governments of member states and non-member states to establish the permanent headquarters on the basis of a set of criteria: presence of diplomatic representation within the country to facilitate multilateral action, accessibility by air, infrastructure. In any event, headquarters agreements always take time to negotiate. And of course, 2022 was spent negotiating the headquarters agreement, mostly with the authorities of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, And it was signed on the 3rd of November that year, 2022. And soon enough, I sought to appoint my first cabinet and start our work from January 2023. That is, we moved in Addis in 2023. But then we had another challenge, which was that the provisional building allocated to the OSC as part from which we are speaking now was not yet renovated and was in dire need of renovations. And so we had to improvise hotel lobbies, then eventually some open space offices as our headquarters whilst we were renovating this building. And at the same time, perhaps because I was too much in a hurry, but I had already lost 1 year of my mandate negotiating the headquarters agreement, we had to hire over 100 staff members in parallel, from scratch, with an institutional culture not yet formed, from across 3 continents, which in itself brought extraordinary logistical challenges. Because usually what happens when you build an organization or a startup is you start with 5 people, they work with you for a year, then you expand to 20, you hire 10 more people who stay with you for a year. We hired 100 in 3 months. And you can imagine the logistical problems of bringing everyone, but also the logistical challenges of space, but also the human challenges that are natural because you're bringing people from different cultures, different professional backgrounds, and ensuring that everybody gets along and that we're moving in the same direction. So that was one of the challenges that we were able to overcome, even though mistakes were made along the way. But the reason I'm mentioning all of this is that when we started then the consolidation and program implementation phase, one of the challenges that happened is between the moment that the OSCE's constitutive charter was adopted in January 2020 and the moment we were able to start to deliver in 2023, right? It is already extraordinary progress in and of itself if you take into account the pandemic. But in the meantime, many of the heads of state, many of the ministers that had attended the founding summit were no longer there. There were elections, there were cabinet reshuffles. And that means as we wanted to implement the program, there is also a reality that we have to mention, which is the OSCE had in a certain sense fallen out of the radar. And we had to resensitize or re-engage with the governments of the member states for them to understand what is the OSCE, how it is necessary, who attended the summit at the time. And therefore there was this entire period of resensitization or re-engagement with the member states, which was also quite challenging. Especially because we moved to Addis Ababa, where the ambassadors themselves, most of them, had not been involved in the creation of the OSCE that had happened in another country. And this is something that we were able to overcome, largely. But then the challenge became, with all of this going on, well, we do not exist to exist. We do not exist for countries to be aware of us. We exist to tangibly contribute to the vision set within the Constitutive Charter. And in this regard, one of the great challenges was what we have to deliver on the program. Even though we're building the team, there's some vacancies, we're resensitizing, we are consolidating, we're renovating. And we worked in that direction, of course, and thankfully, by dedication of the members of the Secretariat, by support also by a number of the member states that supported us to achieve those objectives. I am proud to say that the OSC has delivered and overcome all of those challenges. That is, we were a handful in January 2023. We are now over 100 strong in terms of the Secretariat. We were a promise, documentation on programs. We are now an organization that has launched a Greater South Information System that provides access to more than 400,000 resources to universities. We are now an institution that has launched the OSC Institute, that has already in a few months built the capacities of 15 going on to 16 officials of member states, that they may lead the transformation to which we aspire. We are an institution that has supported the member states in their historic decision to create the world's first union of sovereign borrowers, the Common Leveraging Union of Borrowers, the club. So we have a lot of successes, but again, we are the club of the dissatisfied. And therefore we know there is much more to do, much more to achieve. So this is overall, I think. And also I would add that perhaps why I say we have delivered is, in 2023, we also had to face, especially in January 2023, we had to face the loud skepticism of those who would say this is all very nice and well. But you know, you want to achieve all of this in 2 years? Really? And the truth is that there are many that listened to what we had to say, what we were doing, and they were saying, this is just dreams and plans and sophistry, that we're blinded by our optimism. And I think that over the past 2 years, what we have been able to do is to say, yes, unashamedly, yes, we have dreams. Yes, we have an unwavering optimism of will, but we are not blinded. Because we also have the pessimism of intelligence. But we also have concrete plans, actionable plans to transform dreams and aspirations into palpable reality. But most crucially also perhaps, that we are armed, and this is something you cannot explain. I cannot give you a concrete example. You either understand it or you don't. We are armed, equipped, reinforced by an unwavering, indefatigable determination to fulfill what we consider to be our historic duty. Come what may, whatever the cost, because what we are doing is not for ourselves. I often get asked, Doctor, by some friends or acquaintances by now, that ask me, because as many of you know, it's not unusual that I spend 48 or 72 hours without sleeping to find, when we have a lot of things to deliver, that is. And I often get, I don't take holidays very often. When I do get holidays after 2 days, I go through an existential crisis and start calling the office asking if they have something for me to do. And I get asked about, well, don't you believe you should have a work-life balance? What I say, and I am truthful when I say this, because yes, I will be quite honest. Yes, at times you wake up and you're exhausted. Yes, you wake up at times and you say, you know, I haven't seen my friends in a year. Maybe I should. Sometimes you wake up and you say to yourself, I know. It's true. We believe in the human dimension of development. How can you forget your own human dimension? But then you'll remember, because the point is not if you never get exhausted. The point is not that you never feel lonely. The point is not that you never feel in need of human intercourse. No. The point is that you continue moving forward, regardless of being exhausted. And the reason I often say to those people from time to time that ask me that I can do it is because I am not a billionaire running my private company. And the difference between me dedicating myself at 100% to the company or not is the difference between making $100 million of profit or $500 million of profit. If I was the CEO of a private company and that was the difference, then yes, I would aim towards work-life balance. But I am not. The difference between delivering or not delivering, or delivering more or delivering less, as far as I am concerned, I do not want to impose this on anyone. I am not even saying it is a healthy model. Is the difference between tangibly, concretely contributing to the betterment of the lives of millions, hundreds of millions of people. It is the difference between someone being included within the education system or someone being excluded. It is the difference between contributing to a better world, not a better life for me, or resigning yourself to the status quo and allowing injustice to continue existing, continue proliferating. Why? Because I wanted work-life balance. And so I say this, Doctor, because I think that is also part of the challenges that we've all had to face. That is, with the skepticism. And what overcame the skepticism is the concrete, tangible results. And that was possible because each in our own way, in addition to dreams, in addition to plans, we are equipped with the unwavering, indefatigable determination to fulfill what we consider to be our historic duty. I look at other questions that we may have. Well, Doctor, I will still answer you, but then I will have to move to other questions. Where you ask, Doctor, what will you do to ensure the sustainability of the OSC? What, I suppose, guardrails will you put in place to ensure continuity? Well, I think the sustainability of the OSC has multiple fronts. And I'll be very quick about this. The number one sustainability of the OSC is member state and associate member ownership of this institution. Because they are the decision makers. This is their organization. We are merely the servants of this common vision with devotion to its human dimension. And therefore it is ensuring and engaging with the member states ever more to ensure their ownership. And part of this means getting the Secretariat closer to the member states. And this is why I'm speaking of starting the process of establishing regional offices, of establishing country offices, that we may have this closer proximity to the member states, and from a programmatic technical perspective. I'm not speaking just of political representation. I'm speaking of technical staff that are there to support every day the member states in achieving their aspirations. The second aspect with regards to continuity that I would argue is it is institutionalization. building in within the Secretariat and the organization the necessary procedures, the necessary requirements that make sure that this entire Secretariat and this entire organization does not depend on a single man. And maybe for the next one, a single woman. But that it is an institution with processes, where yes, a Secretary General's vision matters because it may allow the organization to move faster. And the lack of a vision will make the organization move slower. But the main point is building in, with this ownership of the member states, building in those processes that enable the organization to continuously move forward, whether faster or slower, but move forward. And the third, it is the people that are in front of me, the Secretariat members. Because Secretary Generals come and go. But no institution is greater than its institutional memory. And these Secretariat members that are in front of me are those that will be the custodians of that memory, that will enable us to ensure that the OSC continues on its path. I hope I've answered your question. I move on to Scott. Ethiopia has about 80 million poor people, 70% of poverty according to the UN, and as a resident of this country working at an NGO, I'm only seeing the government, I suppose, is only improving the life in the capital. We move on to the next. Since your organization is based, it's still Scott, it's just, since your organization is based in Ethiopia, what does the OSC do to change this reality? And number 3, how can countries of the South address this issue without just charity? Very good. Scott. Let me focus on the OSC part, because I am not in a position to judge particularly what the government is doing, because I'm not an expert on this. But what I would say is the OSC accompanies the member states principally in the framework of our endeavors, that is the common program of the member states, this vision of a third way of development towards endogenous technology development, etc., etc., etc. But also in accordance to their own national priorities. That means that we work with governments to ensure that they have the necessary national capacities, that they have the necessary instruments, that they have the necessary multilateral projects that enables them to address the issue of poverty and the issue of persisting infrastructure divides within the countries. But I would like to, this is just what the OSC does, I've mentioned some of the projects and programs that we have. I cannot go much further than that. But for instance, very concretely, we have 6 strategic sectors where we work with member states in terms of investment. And that is balanced and inclusive education systems, sustainable, integral health systems within the One Health framework of interdependence between human, flora, and fauna health. Work with the member states with regards to sustainable agriculture to achieve not only greater exports, but most importantly, nutritious food for our peoples within our countries. Renewable energy to overcome not only the sources of energy that harm our environment, but that are also highly unreliable for most of our countries, depending on how the price of oil, for instance, fluctuates. Infrastructure. An infrastructure to connect our countries, but also infrastructure within our countries. Because I agree with you that we have to have the lucidity to recognize that there has been a north-south, and continues to be, a north-south divide, and to a certain degree, a north-south dynamic of dominance or centralization in the north. And that we have our norths in the south, even though it's different for every country. But in general, the norths in the south are our capital cities. And that we have to address this. That is the urban-rural divide, without a doubt. And finally, high value-added industrialization. Now, the reason that I raise this is this is what the OSC framework is. But I would like to challenge slightly the underlying, my dear Scott, the underlying assumption, that the majority of the problems within our countries of the South is because our governments are not serious enough, or our governments do not care enough, or our government... And the reason that I say this is that if we want to achieve, and this will go to your question of how can countries of the South address this issue without just charity? If we want to build infrastructure within our countries, if we want to build greater schools, train more teachers within our countries, if we want to ensure food sovereignty and nutritious food for our countries, for our peoples, if we want to achieve high value-added industrialization and quality healthcare for our peoples, we cannot possibly disregard the fact that this requires some capital investment. To be crude, this requires money. And yet we are in a world, my dear Scott, where, as I mentioned earlier, 3.3 billion people are in countries where the governments have no other choice than to spend more on debt service than they can on health or education. And that when we seek to refinance our loans, we are given loans to bail out, that is, to our debt. But we are told, Scott, as countries of the South, but you have to be more efficient, and therefore you need to cut public services, you need to cut social services, and you need to invest in the productive sectors. With completely free market capitalism, that is, no regulation, little to no taxation, that when this happens, now why should we go very far? My dear Scott, in the 80s, the IMF and the World Bank came to countries in Africa, since you're based in Ethiopia, during the structural adjustment programs. And one of the things that they said to the countries was, in Africa, you have too many teachers. It is not sustainable. The ratio of teachers is too high. So if you want this finance, part of the package conditions is you need to rationalize your education system, have fewer teachers, which is what those countries did. And look at us now. One of the main challenges that face education systems in Africa, as well as in the South, is a lack of qualified teachers. And so you ask me, my dear Scott, how can countries of the South address this issue without just charity? Well, this is the only way to address it. Because the problem is not about charity, it is about justice. And whereas, of course, we welcome the work of NGOs, I don't know yours, but we welcome the work of NGOs within our countries that are well-intentioned. Nevertheless, what we actually want as countries is an international financial architecture that enables us to have debt relief, that enables us to invest in education and health. We need an international financial architecture that enables us as countries to have access to highly concessional finance that allows us to invest in our strategic development areas that benefit our peoples without being told that we need to rationalize by cutting teacher jobs. We are, as countries of the South, determined, or what we need is that we need more justice in our economic transactions, where we are paid fair prices for the commodities that we sell, including for lithium batteries. But at the same time, I recognize, my dear Scott, that we are not here only pointing fingers, because we are not forlorn lovers that cry over their misery. No, we know how to take our responsibilities. And part of taking up our own responsibilities means also having better strategies that require multilateral action to have strategic sovereignty enhancing development that reduces our fiscal pressure, the fiscal pressure faced by our governments, and tangibly contributes to our people's well-being and welfare. And that means, in part, going through, I believe, strategic investments that I've already mentioned. Investing in balanced and inclusive education. No development without education, but an education that is transformed in order to be transformative. That is not one that generates unemployment, but that contributes to a vision of development. Integral health system, where again, we are not just speaking of curative medicine that is held only within the hands of the large pharmaceutical companies, but also preventative care. We're speaking again of renewable energy, but when we say renewable energy, not just their use, but their production within our countries. There is no reason that we must continue to import all of the renewable energy technologies when the critical minerals that exist within our soil are the ones that are necessary for the development of those technologies. Of investing once more into infrastructure. You speak of charity. Investing into infrastructure with an understanding that today South-South cooperation is prohibitively expensive in terms of time and in terms of money. If I want to travel to Latin America and the Caribbean, most countries, with the exception of Brazil, I would have to travel from here to Europe, and from Europe to Latin America, which makes it more expensive and makes me lose more time. And therefore, if we want our countries to be able to have the necessary income in order to invest in those critical sectors of development for our peoples, we also need to have greater trade opportunities amongst ourselves. Investing in high value added industrialization, and this goes back to the issue of justice. Today, I take the example of coffee once more. Coffee, which only grows in the 3 continents of the South. Yet coffee, where you look at the top 10 coffee exporters in the world, 4 are in a region of the world, 4 are in a region of the world that does not have a single coffee tree. And that is France, Switzerland, Italy, and Germany. And each one of them, Scott, each one of them exports more coffee than Ethiopia and Uganda, the largest African exporters, and some of them export more than Colombia in Latin America. Because we continue to export green beans, whereas they export processed coffee, Nescafe, capsules, etc. And whereas we have no problem with them doing this, fair and square, taking up our own responsibilities is recognizing that as coffee producers, we export our bags of coffee on average at $2.50, whereas the coffee processors, but not producers, export coffee at $40 the bag on average. That taking up our own responsibility is investing in high value addition in the coffee sector, for example, that we must start exporting our own instant coffee, our own processed coffee at better prices that enable us to invest in our countries. But also, and I would like to finish there, and this is part of everything that the OSC does, but I would like to mention, Scott, as well, Because I often say the difference between charity and solidarity. Nobody's saying that we don't want solidarity, we want solidarity. But charity is sharing the leftovers. Solidarity is sharing the meal with an understanding that we share a community of destiny. And when you look at transactions between North and South, including development aid, including flux from NGOs, including legal and illegal financial transactions, that is tax evasion included, right? But also taking into account the remesas, the repatriation of money from immigrant communities in the north to the south. Taking all of those flux, in any given year, there is $1 trillion that leaves the north to go to the south, and $2 trillion that leave the south to go to the north. And therefore, as countries of the south, we don't want any charity. We want more equitable distribution. Mind you, 1 trillion north-south, 2 trillion south-north. Does this sound like 3 continents that actually need charity? Or does it sound like countries and continents that and peoples that require equitable cooperation? Nobody's asking for reparations. That is not what I am asking. I'm asking of cooperation, mutually beneficial partnerships amongst equals. And so, you know, when you send, you, not you, Scott, I mean impersonal you, when you send bags of rice, unless it's an emergency situation, right, of a conflict or a natural disaster, but on a regular basis, bags of rice, and let's say they're free of charge, I am terribly sorry to say that is not support. That is not support. Because that, yes, feeds people, but we will need more rice to come next month. Second, that is ultimately, what this ultimately means is that we're also killing the possibility of our own farmers to produce rice or wheat. Real help, and this is where solidarity comes in, is let's send us fertilizers, fertilizer technology. Send us tractors. Send us machinery that enables us to produce within our countries. How to overcome this? Solidarity, not charity. We don't want, for instance, to depend constantly on a handful of vendors for critical health technology within our countries. Don't send us the machine. Work with us to enable us to start producing that machine in our countries, even at the regional level. And this is the difference between solidarity and charity that we speak about. And the only way our countries of the South can overcome sustainably this poverty gap, so to speak, is through solidarity, not charity. You know, we made extraordinary gains, Scott, in terms of reducing poverty within our countries, around the world. And during COVID, the United Nations published a report that showcased that millions of people slid back into poverty. And what does that mean? That means that the charity model was not a solid foundation for these people getting out of poverty. That the moment development aid dried up, they slid back into poverty. And what we want to build is not only a society where, with reduced poverty, we want to build prosperous societies that are simultaneously sustainable, and that requires us to work with solidarity, but also mutually beneficial partnerships of equals, and not merely charity. I hope I've answered your question. Feel free to challenge me on any point if needs be. Let me look at other questions that I may have received. I see a comment or question. Okay, from Carlos O'Grife, I think we have a very interesting opportunity to change the visibility of the research done, since with the LLM, so large language models, we do not need in principle the production of articles, but of structured data sets. I go to the next one. This will put every researcher in the same level. What is your opinion on the impact of AI on the dissemination of knowledge? So thank you very much for this question. And because I realize that we're running way past the usual hour, but I will still answer it. I'll simply try to be more concise. And what I would say is, of course, AI has extraordinary potential in terms of the dissemination of knowledge, taking into account some other ethical considerations as well as what they call in the field hallucinations, but I do believe that with some work, hallucinations being when the artificial intelligence articulate things that are simply not true. So I do believe this can be overcome with the right frameworks, ethical and regulatory. But I do believe, as I've said, artificial intelligence can be a very powerful tool to leverage for the dissemination of knowledge. However, I go back, so far I've only said the obvious, but I go back to what I was saying earlier, that so long as artificial intelligence remains trained on data sets that are predominantly from the north, what we will see, even in its dissemination of knowledge, because it will be trained on data sets from the north, what we will see is a replication, unintended, sure, but still a reproduction of the dynamic that makes knowledge from the north more visible and more disseminated than knowledge from the south. And therefore, I do believe that artificial intelligence, subject to regulatory and ethical frameworks being implemented, can have a very positive impact. In fact, as I've said, we're already using it in the Greater South Information System, GreSFET, of the OSC. But that we must work crucially on making sure that that AI is more adapted to the realities, contexts, priorities, and languages of researchers in the South when it comes to knowledge dissemination and production. The other dimension, of course, that is very problematic is because AI is developed by human beings, we transfer to it, whether we like it or not, whether we're conscious of it or not, our own biases or interpretative frameworks. And therefore, if AI for knowledge dissemination is limited to knowledge understood as academic papers, then we are also reproducing the challenge of the marginalization and exclusion of ancestral knowledge, of popular knowledge, of endogenous knowledge. And therefore, I believe there's a lot of potential, but a lot of risks. I am not a blinded optimist, nor am I a doom and gloom pessimist. I do believe that we should leverage AI, but I believe that we need to come together, and this is why we're proposing an AI commission. Come together, reflect about all those dynamics, all consequences intended or not that AI may have, in order to leverage it without unintended negative consequences. I hope I've answered your question. Please feel free to push me. I see a comment from Facebook user that says, concrètement, it's in French, I will read it in French, answer it in French, and then there's one last question that I see from WhatsApp, which I will get to. Concrètement, par exemple, à l'appui, comment l'Organisation de la coopération du Sud soutient les États membres dans 6 domaines stratégiques, à savoir la technologie endogène et l'industrialisation, à haute valeur ajoutée, développement des infrastructures, santé intégrale, énergie renouvelable, agriculture durable, ainsi qu'éducation équilibrée et inclusive. Alors, écoutez, excellente question. Je vous en remercie. Mais écoutez, je vais chercher à être très concis, tout en sachant que tout ce que nous disons ici, tout ce que nous articulons dans ces épisodes, dans ces sessions, absolument tout, c'est le message de dire qu'il n'y a pas d'homme providentiel et donc il n'y a pas d'organisation providentielle. Donc je vais vous donner les exemples très concrets de ce que l'organisation fait, mais tous ces efforts, il requiert d'une articulation collective conjointe pour leur réalisation durable. Et donc cela requiert aussi de la participation de chacun d'entre nous, y compris vous qui me posez la question. Mais, donc je vous réponds, sans vouloir être trop long. Donc par rapport à l'éducation équilibrée et inclusive, ce que nous travaillons avec les États membres, en ce sens où, sur plusieurs domaines, mais je vous donne un exemple très concret, qui est l'Institut OCS. L'Institut OCS qui rejette, d'une certaine manière, le modèle qui est devenu le modèle du statu quo, où une organisation internationale envoie ses experts, ses fonctionnaires à la capitale d'un État membre pour un atelier de 3 jours, pour disparaître pendant 6 mois, et revenir pour un atelier de 2 jours et avoir l'audace de dire que nous avons renforcé les capacités nationales. Donc, l'Institut OCS adopte un modèle différent, qui est plus coûteux, mais qui est beaucoup plus durable et concret et bénéfique pour les États membres, qui est celui de recevoir les experts des ministères de l'Éducation, par exemple, à l'Institut OCS, où ils restent pendant 2 mois, où l'organisation prend en charge leur hébergement, prend en charge leur repas, etc., transport. La seule chose, c'est que les États membres, eux, prennent en charge les billets d'avion. Et ils restent avec nous pendant 2 mois d'un programme de formation, de renforcement des capacités intensif, au bout duquel ces experts n'ont pas seulement des capacités individuelles renforcées, mais ils deviennent eux-mêmes des formateurs qui, en rentrant à leur ministère, ont la capacité d'organiser des ateliers et des formations pour leurs collègues, pour renforcer véritablement cette capacité nationale. Donc, éducation équilibrée et inclusive. Nous avons d'autres exemples, mais je me limite à un exemple par secteur. Ensuite, par rapport à l'industrialisation de haute valeur ajoutée, eh bien là, nous travaillons avec les États membres, en partie, par exemple, sur le développement de technologies endogènes, qui est une industrialisation de haute valeur ajoutée. C'est-à-dire, de manière très concrète, nous travaillons avec chaque État membre et le collectif d'États membres pour générer des contextes ou des environnements plus propices au développement technologique. Et ensuite, le rôle de l'organisation, c'est de prendre aussi ces petites start-up d'entrepreneurs de nos États membres et de les visibiliser internationalement pour qu'ils aient une économie d'échelle, pour qu'ils aient des échanges et des collaborations et des partenariats stratégiques. Donc ça, c'est une des choses très concrètes. Donc ça, nous le faisons à GreSFET, the Greater South Fair for Endogenous Technology, le salon du Grand Sud pour les technologies endogènes, où nous facilitons cette dynamique. Mais nous avons aussi, de manière très concrète, un rôle à jouer en termes de technologie que nous faisons, et ce qui fait que l'organisation est peut-être inusuelle, où nous avons dans cette organisation des développeurs qui préparent des logiciels à code ouvert que nous remettons aux États membres, qui ensuite peuvent les adapter, les transformer, mais surtout qui leur permet, vu que c'est à code ouvert, de ne pas dépendre ni de l'organisation, ni d'une entreprise technologique pour ces logiciels. Ensuite, je vois qu'il y a de plus en plus de questions, de manière très, très concrète. L'organisation de coopération du Sud aussi travaille, parce que vous savez, la question de l'infrastructure, ou la question d'ailleurs de la santé intégrale, la question des énergies renouvelables, écoutez, il faut dire une chose, oui ou non? On parle français. Il faut dire une chose, c'est que nous n'avons pas inventé la question de l'énergie renouvelable. Nous n'avons pas inventé la question de l'infrastructure. Notre rôle ici à l'OCS, ce n'est pas de dire que nous avons tout inventé. Notre rôle, c'est de trouver ce point de connexion dans une vision cohérente pour nos États membres, mais ensuite de nous donner à chacun les instruments nécessaires pour passer des idées sur lesquelles nous sommes tous d'accord, donc l'infrastructure, on est d'accord. Mais comment réaliser ça? Et donc le problème fondamental que nous avons en termes d'industrialisation de haute valeur ajoutée, le problème que nous avons fondamentalement en termes d'infrastructure, ben c'est le problème du financement. Il faut parler de manière claire. Moi, je vous dois une réponse transparente. Parce que sinon, ça ne sert à rien d'être ici. Et la réponse transparente, c'est que nous devons parler du financement. Que ça plaise ou que ça déplaise. C'est la vérité. Et le financement passe par parler de la question de la dette. Et donc, la question de la dette, je le disais plutôt en anglais, je le répète en français, nous vivons dans un monde où 3,3 milliards de personnes vivent dans des pays où les gouvernements n'ont pas d'autre choix que de dépenser plus au service de la dette qu'ils ne le peuvent sur l'éducation ou la santé. Oublions la question de l'infrastructure. Et nous avons vu des mécanismes qui ont été créés en 2020 pour que nos pays puissent avoir un allègement de la dette, mais à 4 ans de la création de ces mécanismes, il faut faire une analyse sobre, lucide, sans passion excessive et se rendre compte qu'aucun de nos États, pas un, n'a reçu un accord ou a atteint un accord final pour l'allègement de la dette. Pourquoi? Parce que ce sont des mécanismes à nouveau qui sont de coordination des créanciers. Et donc nous avons besoin de meilleure coordination des débiteurs. Et c'est pour ça que les États membres de l'organisation, en novembre 2023, ont créé cette union de levier commun des débiteurs comme première union qui permet à nos pays débiteurs de coordonner leurs positions et s'ils le veulent, il n'y a pas d'obligation, mais s'ils le veulent, de négocier collectivement l'allègement de la dette. Mais l'allègement en soi, c'est insuffisant, parce qu'au jour de l'allègement plus 1, nous avons besoin de nouveaux financements, n'est-ce pas Annabelle? Et si ces nouveaux financements nous arrivent avec les mêmes conditions, les mêmes taux d'intérêt, les mêmes périodes de maturité, eh bien, nous ne nous en sortons pas parce que ce seront les mêmes conditions qui nous ont amenés à un niveau insoutenable de dette. Et donc, que faut-il faire? Que faut-il faire? Eh bien, à notre sens, il faut aussi avoir des instruments novateurs pour avoir de nouveaux financements. Donc, l'union de levier commun des débiteurs, le club, est un financement ainsi. Je ne vais pas vous ennuyer avec les détails, sauf si vous le voulez, mais vous m'écrivez pour me dire que vous voulez plus de détails. L'union de levier commun est un instrument novateur pour que nos pays puissent demander des fonds collectifs qui réduisent le risque des créanciers, mais qui aussi nous permet d'atteindre des financements plus concessionnels pour nos pays, tout en créant à l'intérieur de l'union de levier commun des débiteurs le fonds de solidarité de résilience. Si un de nos États se trouve dans une situation qui pour des raisons exogènes, ne peut pas repayer pendant une période sa dette, les États membres peuvent activer ce fonds pour soutenir cet État, pour qu'il ne rentre pas en situation de défaut à la dette. Mais aussi, nous travaillons justement pour ce prochain biennium dans l'opérationnalisation pleine de la subsidiaire financière de l'Organisation de coopération du Sud, qui veut dire la Banque de développement multilatéral de l'organisation qui apportera aux États des investissements très concrets dans ces secteurs pour qu'ils contribuent à leur développement stratégique et qui renforcent leur souveraineté, mais aussi de nouveaux financements hautement concessionnels et parfois même des dotations pour ce développement. Donc voilà, j'ai essayé de résumer, il y a plus d'initiatives, il y a plus de travail que nous menons, mais j'espère que j'ai d'autres questions, mon cher Facebook user. Si ce n'est pas le cas, vous me le faites savoir, on continue. Je vois, I look at other questions. So, I see a question from, do you think I could have another, thank you. I see a question from Mike from Addis Coffee Exporter. This was a question sent through WhatsApp, so it cannot show on the screen, but I will read it out, even though it's relatively long. Thank you for your thank you for your leadership and the impactful work the OSC is doing. You've highlighted many important issues. the lack of cooperation and knowledge sharing amongst Global South countries, especially in research and traditional knowledge. Addressing this gap is essential, and developing technologies for the South by the South is crucial. I believe we must create an environment where young people can truly succeed. This requires providing access to quality education and infrastructure, especially in rural areas. By equipping teachers and students with resources and establishing platforms for knowledge sharing across the Global South, we can empower the next generation for sustainable progress. How do you envision the South collaborating with the North on equal footing to advocate for our needs? One of our shared resources amongst Global South nations is coffee. Currently, we export mainly green coffee, but it would benefit us to sell value-added products like roasted coffee, capsules, and instant coffee. However, high tariffs make it challenging to compete in the North. Do you see opportunities in the South to trade value-added coffee within the South? Mutual cooperation with the North benefits their shared interest. Do you believe the North will support our efforts or create barriers? Hopefully, we the South will have mutual cooperation to protect our shared interests. Well, my dear Mike, allow me first and foremost to thank you for joining us, and most crucially, for the questions that you've articulated. Allow me to say, first and foremost, from the onset, because I will merge your questions into one. The first and foremost, which I've said in the past, I want to ratify here. Our endeavor from the Greater South, our endeavor from the OSC, our determination from this Secretariat is not one that is motivated against the North. Because we are not individuals, countries, institutions that define themselves in opposition. This endeavor for a third way of development is one that is aimed at achieving a certain vision that is a positive vision. We are acting for something, not against something. And this is why we in fact don't use Global South, we use Greater South, because we firmly believe that in addition to the Global South, the countries that you conceive when you hear Global South, we also take into account intellectuals, movements, institutions, researchers that also believe in changing the status quo so that it is more equitable for everyone, even if they are based in the North or are from the North. That being said, your question is far more concrete, and I would argue that, look, I think that, number one, what we have lacked until now to ensure greater cooperation amongst our countries, better terms for our countries, in order to have cooperation on equal footing with the North, because that is what we're asking. We're not asking to be dominating the world, we're not asking to see the North disappear, far from it. What we are saying is we want equality in terms of engagement. And in order to do that, what we need to what we lacked until now to be able to achieve it was platforms of countries of the Greater South with executive capacity through a secretariat to negotiate collectively when we feel that it is necessary to negotiate collectively. Similarly, I would argue that when it comes to coffee, I entirely agree with you, apologies. I entirely agree with you, because that is our vision. But you mentioned indeed that there is high tariffs to compete in the North. That is entirely true. And not just tariffs, you have certain unreasonable requirements now with regards to proving that your coffee is organic in order to be able to enter, which is great if you are an industrial farm, but the majority of coffee farmers, we're speaking of 25 million smallholder farmers who cannot afford to prove every single step of their production capacity. So it is true that it is very difficult to compete in the North, but the thing is that we don't need to compete in the North. Let the Swiss enjoy their Nescafé. Let the French enjoy their Nespresso. That is absolutely fine. We're not asking for those companies to disappear. But we also want to produce our own instant coffee, our own processed coffee, that is encapsulated coffee, and so on and so forth. And not all countries of the South are coffee producers. The coffee is available in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, but not all countries of Africa, not all countries of Latin America, not all countries of Asia are coffee producers. And therefore, what we want to do is invest in this coffee high value addition, but also open up markets within our countries in order to sell that coffee, not just out of solidarity, but also because it makes more economic sense to purchase your coffee from your neighbor than to purchase coffee that went from your neighbor to Switzerland, from Switzerland back to you. And in order to do this, we need to invest, of course, in the plants of coffee roasting, coffee processing, coffee encapsulating, but we also need to invest, as I've mentioned before, into infrastructure. Infrastructure that enables, for instance, cheaper transportation of our produce within each region and across regions. We need to invest in warehousing that is appropriate for this kind of produce. That is, we need to invest in a supply chain across our countries. And therefore, is it challenging? Yes, but we have to endeavor in that direction. Now you ask, whether do you believe the North will support our efforts or create barriers? And of course, I would argue, at the risk of being too lengthy or long-winded in my answer, that yes, there is such a thing as North and South, but again, not all countries of the North are the same. And even one and the same country in the North, depending on who wins an election, can become something else. So we have to have that complexity of analysis as well. But look, I think that the main endeavor is we are talking about mutually beneficial partnerships. That is, we are not asking for charity. We are asking for endeavors that achieve our authentic development aspirations, whilst also benefiting a country from the North. That is, if tomorrow there is a private company from the North in a country that allows for indirect investment to come and invest in a coffee processing plant, why not? So long as it's produced here. However, we shouldn't determine our endeavors and our aspirations on whether or not it gets the approval of the North or not. We must undertake with the fortitude, with the courage, our endeavors in the knowledge that we know, we believe, we are unwavering in our determination to ensure that what we believe is right be undertaken. And if the North supports us, beautiful. If it doesn't, we wish them the best. That is it. So I hope I've answered your question in a concise manner. I see a question from Dalia from Mexico, who says, greetings and congratulations on your Live with the SG series. Would you please provide updates on the OSC Transregional Partnership in Education for Development, TPED, and possible opportunities to contribute to its efforts? Many things. So Dalia, I would like to thank you for the question. The truth is TPED, the Transregional Partnership in Education for Development, has not yet been fully activated as of now. Because, as you know, TPED was meant to be this endeavor or initiative of the OSC that would bring together a number of intergovernmental organizations working in education to have better coordination amongst ourselves. But of course, since it's not entirely dependent on the OSC Secretariat, but also on the times and the decision-making processes of each intergovernmental organization, we are still awaiting to fully activate it. But of course, once it is activated, you may most certainly, we will most certainly announce it, and at this point, of course, there will be probably opportunities of getting involved with regard to TPED. I hope I've answered your question. And then I see a last question from No Name. That's a very nice name. From Ethiopia, who says, hello dear SG, we wanted to know more details about the December's GreSFET event. Could you give us some details? Well, I don't think I can go much more in detail than I already have, but what I can say is GreSFET as I've mentioned, is the Greater South Fair for Endogenous Technologies, where we're inviting startups from across our countries, as well as our countries, for a 2-day fair that will be on the 2nd and 3rd of December, if my memory does not fail me, where we will be providing exhibition space for the startups of our companies, our countries, that they may have greater visibility, they may have greater collaboration opportunities, and may forge strategic partnerships, whilst also inviting some speakers for debates, for panel discussions, to exchange knowledge amongst countries, both in terms of policy making, but also in terms of building a startup within the context of the South. And of course, this is open to the general public. That is, it's our invitation only. And you may, through the GreSFET website, which I think will be shared in the comment section, you will be in a position to register, but it's easy. It's gresfet.osc.int. To register and apply to have exhibition space and so on and so forth. So this is overall the GreSFET. It will happen in Addis Ababa in partnership with the Ministry of Innovation and Technology, and will happen, if my memory does not fail me, at the Science Museum in Addis Ababa. I hope I've provided you more information, but of course on the website itself you will find more information, criteria, and so on. But also you will have there a possibility of contacting directly the specific service within the Secretariat that is in charge of this on the day-to-day, and they will be able to provide you more up-to-date information. I hope that I have answered all questions. Have I missed any question? No? Beautiful. Well, I am grateful to everyone that had the patience of listening to my long tirade at the beginning, and the ones that also had the fortitude of lasting for the entirety of my responses to the questions that were asked. But again, I think that it is important to engage as much as possible on those issues as long as possible, because, as I've said it before, a third way of development from and by the Greater South for humanity is only possible. It is only possible when it is a collective endeavor, where every single one of us, beyond the Secretariat, beyond the state membership of the OSC, becomes a protagonist of this common endeavor, this collective endeavor. And of course, we remain, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, aware of the fierce urgency of now. That tomorrow is today, and that we must move forward together. Because, as I've quoted in 2 episodes in the past, as Mario Benedetti said, y hay quienes se desmueren, y hay quienes se desviven, y así entre todos logran lo que era un imposible. Que todo el mundo sepa que el sur también existe. That there are those who die and those who live doing their utmost in this way, amongst themselves, amongst all of them. They achieve what was once an impossible, that the entire world may know that the South also exists.